We often find ourselves trying to make sense of different cultures, and it can feel like trying to solve a really complex puzzle, right?
Absolutely.
But when you consider a culture as ancient and influential as China, well, it's almost like you're looking at a puzzle with pieces that go back millennia. It makes you wonder if we can ever truly grasp its essence.
It's a huge challenge, and one that has, well, captivated many people for generations. Even Arthur Henderson Smith, someone who spent over half a century living in China and really had a deep affection for the country.
50 years, wow.
Yeah, even he felt that fully capturing the Chinese character in words was, well, an almost impossible task. His book, Chinese Characteristics, published way back in 1899, really digs into this struggle.
And for this deep dive, we're looking at something pretty interesting. It's excerpts from Smith's work, but they've been translated and annotated by a contemporary Chinese individual, someone who goes by Aya.
That's right.
It sounds like this translator felt that maybe previous English versions hadn't quite, hit the mark.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Uh, He put a lot of effort into refining those earlier translations, even putting back sections that had been left out before. Their perspective gives us this really valuable contemporary lens.
Okay.
And they emphasize a central theme that really runs through Smith's work.
Yeah.
This very close relationship between the fundamental character of the Chinese people and the nature of their government.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit. This idea of national character and governance being so tightly linked.
Yeah.
The translator suggests that while political systems might change, evolve over time, the underlying traits and tendencies of the people themselves have shown this kind of remarkable stability. That's a really fascinating starting point.
It certainly is, and it really sets the stage for our mission today, I think.
Hmm.
We're going to explore some of the key characteristics that Smith identified in his book, but with these added insights from Taino's perspective.
Right.
Our goal isn't to make, broad statements about China today, obviously, but more to examine these historical observations that might still offer us glimpses into enduring cultural dynamics, while, of course, fully recognizing the immense changes over the last century.
So we're not looking for definitive answers about modern China, more like trying to understand how things were seen historically. Got it. Where should we dive in first?
Well, a really foundational concept for understanding Chinese social interaction, both according to Smith and highlighted by our translator, is saving face.
Ah, saving face.
Okay, now, while you might have a general idea of what saving face means, in this context, it's a much more profound and nuanced concept than just, avoiding embarrassment.
Okay, so it's not just about, not wanting to look silly in public.
Not really, no. Face here really encompasses your social standing, your honor, your overall reputation. Smith observed this strong theatrical instinct, he called it, in everyday Chinese interactions.
Theatrical, how so?
Well, people routinely used quite dramatic language in actions. Think about expressions like leaving the stage with honor or without face. These weren't just casual figures of speech. They reflected this deep, constant awareness of how you were being perceived by others.
Uh-huh.
So beyond just politeness, face acts as this fundamental regulator of social interactions. And it was often prioritized even over, say, factual accuracy or even personal gain.
So it's almost like a form of social capital, like something you protect.
In a way, yes, absolutely. Face operates as a critical element in pretty much all social dealings, maybe even more so than in many Western cultures.
Mm-hmm.
Smith points out that when resolving disagreements,
Yeah.
the ultimate goal wasn't always strict justice, like we might think of it in the West. It was often more about a careful balancing of face for everyone involved.
Yeah.
A bit like maintaining a European balance of power, he suggests.
Interesting analogy.
Distributing face equitably was often seen as more important than figuring out who is strictly right.
That's really counterintuitive from some perspectives. Do we have some specific examples from the book, how this actually played out?
Oh, absolutely. Smith provides a number of quite vivid illustrations. Take the example of a coolie who first denied stealing a tennis ball.
Okay.
But then, moments later, he sort of found it in his sleeve, claiming it was just been lost there.
Ah, so he didn't admit the lie, but the ball reappeared.
Exactly. Or the maid who hid a pencil sharpener and then later discovered it under a tablecloth. To our way of thinking, these actions might seem, well, illogical or maybe even dishonest.
Right.
But for the individuals involved, they were fundamentally about preserving appearances, maintaining face.
So in those moments, the appearance of innocence or maybe competence was more important than the actual truth of the matter.
Precisely. We also hear about a servant who offered to forfeit wages that were owed to him rather than admit to losing something.
Just to avoid saying he messed up.
Yes, to avoid the loss of face associated with being seen as negligent or careless. Or a creditor might make these loud, empty threats to a debtor they knew couldn't possibly repay.
Why do that?
Just to uphold the appearance of being in control of the situation. To save their own face as the creditor. Even a servant facing dismissal might deliberately misbehave to sort of force the termination on their own terms. Again, as a way to save face.
Wow, those examples really highlight how much this concept of face could dictate behavior, even when it seems completely counterintuitive from, well, an outside perspective.
It went even further sometimes. Smith recounts this custom of allowing a local official, even when being executed.
Executed.
Yes, allowing him to wear his official robes during the execution. It was seen as this final symbolic act to preserve his face in the eyes of the community.
Goodness.
So this profound emphasis on outward appearance, combined with what Smith also saw as a significant need for personal privacy. This led, according to the translator, to a historical development of really sophisticated skills in what they call dramatic living.
Dramatic living. That's a really evocative phrase. What does that mean exactly?
Oh, this dramatic living essentially meant becoming highly attuned to social cues, to the expectations tied to your specific position within this really intricate social hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't necessarily about a lack of genuine feeling or inner sincerity,
Yeah.
but more a deep understanding that social harmony, and sometimes even just personal safety, often depended on convincingly playing the role that was expected of you based on your status.
But I mean, in a society so focused on that outward performance, was there any value placed on like inner authenticity or maybe a different way of being?
That's a great question. And the translator introduces a really interesting contrast here.
Mm.
The figure of the scholar.
Okay, this called
These individuals, they cultivated their inner world through lots of reading and learning, and they were particularly valued, especially during periods of societal upheaval, for their honesty and their wisdom. So there's a suggestion of this tension, between these two societal elements, the performative aspects driven by the necessity of face, and this inner integrity that was prized in the scholar class.
So a kind of duality there.
Exactly. And while the imperial examination system, the Sin, certainly shaped society in huge ways, the translator emphasizes that for the vast majority of the population, face and sticking to etiquette remained absolutely crucial for just navigating daily life and, frankly, ensuring survival.
Okay, that gives us a really good grasp of this complex idea of saving face. Let's maybe move on to the next characteristic Smith identified, thrift.
Right, thrift.
Now, thrift is something that's valued in many cultures, of course, but what specific observations did Smith make about it in the Chinese context? Was it different somehow?
You're right, thrift isn't unique to China. However, Smith argued that the Chinese people possessed this remarkable degree of skill in duck, and that word encompasses not just being frugal, but also actively avoiding waste and making the absolute most of very, very limited resources. He was particularly struck by the extreme simplicity of the diet for the vast majority of people, relying heavily on basic staples, rice, beans, millet, various vegetables. Meat was an infrequent luxury.
Right.
The overwhelming picture here is not just of carefulness, but of a society often operating at the very margins of survival. Resourcefulness wasn't just a virtue, it was a daily necessity. And that's a point the translator really underscores too.
It's almost hard to imagine such a basic diet being enough for such a huge population.
And yet, Smith reports that in ordinary years, an adult could apparently sustain themselves on the equivalent of less than 2 American cents per day at that time.
2 cents. Wow.
Yeah, and during famines, this figure would drop even lower. He credits the high level of Chinese culinary ingenuity, creating a diverse range of palatable dishes from these incredibly simple ingredients. He even cites another writer, Wingrove Cook, comparing it favorably to European cooking in that respect.
So they were masters at making a little go a very, very long way. That's clear.
Absolutely. Smith was also profoundly impressed by the almost complete absence of waste in Chinese households. Leftovers, no matter how tiny, were invariably repurposed. Always.
Nothing thrown away.
Pretty much. He even uses the visibly poor condition of stray dogs and cats as a stark illustration. These animals barely managed to survive on the absolute minimum of scraps because there just wasn't much left over.
That's quite a vivid image.
It is. Smith draws a contrast with what he saw as greater wastefulness in newer nations, like America at the time. He mentions the common practice of even saving leftover tea leaves to rebrew and drink again later.
That level of resourcefulness is something we probably don't see as often, maybe, in many Western societies today.
Probably not to that extent, no. He also observed the incredibly wide range of items that were considered edible. This included animals that had died from various causes, even disease. Yeah, there was a clear economic rationale driving this, even though there was a general awareness of potential health risks. He mentions people eating dead dogs, cats, horses, mules, donkeys, and even the deliberate poisoning of dogs specifically for food.
That certainly sounds quite extreme to our, well, modern sensibilities.
It does, and it really underscores the intense economic pressures that shaped these practices. This thriftiness extended to the meticulous conservation of fuel for cooking, too.
How so?
Smith describes the use of thin-bottomed pots, specifically designed to maximize the heat they could get from really meager fuel sources like dried leaves and crop stalks. Even collecting the fuel was this painstaking process. Children often had the job of gathering every tiny scrap they could find. Every little bit counted.
Every little bit truly did, it sounds like.
Precisely. And the resourcefulness with textiles, with cloth, was equally remarkable. Every scrap was utilized. Nothing was just discarded. Smith contrasts this with the then-emerging Western practice of charitable donations of old clothes. He suggests that even seemingly unusable bits of fabric in the West would likely find a practical purpose in China, maybe being sewn into the soles of shoes, for instance.
Right, like you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, he even mentions the practice of carefully saving paper that had writing on it and sewing it onto silk to create durable, reusable banners.
It really paints a picture of a society where absolutely nothing was taken for granted. Not a scrap of paper, not a twig.
Exactly. Small-scale vendors were acutely aware of even the most minute potential profits on everyday items, like matches. Old account books were commonly repurposed for practical uses, maybe covering windows or even making paper lanterns.
Incredible.
Smith shares some truly poignant anecdotes, too, like sedan chair carriers going to extraordinary lengths, really suffering just to save a few pennies on food during long, hard journeys. It highlights the extreme nature of this thrift, which is so often just driven by sheer poverty.
It sounds like a constant, unrelenting struggle for survival that basically necessitated this incredible level of frugality.
And that's precisely the counter-argument, or perhaps a clarification, that the translator introduces.
Okay, what's their take?
They argue that this pervasive thrift wasn't so much an inherent national characteristic, like a cultural value people chose, but rather an absolute necessity forced upon the majority by widespread poverty and, importantly, exploitation by officials throughout Chinese history.
Ah, so blaming the system, to some extent.
Yes. They draw a contrast with the often lavish spending of the wealthy elite, suggesting that this extreme frugality wasn't a universal trait across all levels of society at all.
That certainly provides a different lens, doesn't it? So is it an ingrained cultural value of thrift or more a practical response to incredibly harsh economic realities and maybe unfair systems? It's likely, I suppose, a complex mix of both, shaped by specific historical circumstances.
Precisely. It's rarely just one thing, is it?
Yeah.
Now, let's turn our attention to the third characteristic we'll explore today: diligence and industry.
Okay, diligence.
Smith clearly identified this as a really defining characteristic of the Chinese people he observed.
Diligence, that consistent, focused effort in your work or whatever you're doing, it's generally seen as a positive attribute pretty much everywhere, I'd say. How did Smith specifically analyze it in the Chinese context?
Well, Smith assessed a nation's diligence along three key dimensions: duration, like how consistently people worked; breadth, the sheer number of people who were diligent; and depth, the intensity of their effort.
Okay, duration, breadth, depth.
Got it. And he argued that both short-term visitors and long-term residents in China overwhelmingly agreed on the remarkable diligence of the Chinese population. He even draws this parallel to John Wesley's famous motto
Oh, yeah.
about doing all the good you can, by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, etc., suggesting that this kind of unwavering dedication was just readily apparent in Chinese society.
So a really strong work ethic was something that was immediately noticeable, both to outsiders and to people who lived there a long time.
Absolutely. He observed that even individuals who had achieved wealth tended to remain actively involved in managing their businesses, rather than just, withdrawing into a life of leisure.
Interesting.
He then proceeds to examine the diligence he witnessed across various social strata, starting with the scholar class.
The scholar class traditionally held in very high esteem in China, right?
Indeed. And Smith describes the incredibly intense competition for official positions within the imperial bureaucracy.
Yeah.
You had vast numbers of individuals rigorously preparing, studying for years, vying for a relatively small number of openings.
Must have been tough.
Incredibly. He emphasizes the many long years of dedicated study and unwavering perseverance, often spanning multiple generations within a single family, that were typically required to succeed in the civil service examinations.
Generations. Wow.
Yeah. He even provides some quite striking examples he gleaned from the Beijing Gazette, the official record of elderly candidates, some in their 80s, even 90s,
90.
who were still actively participating in and, remarkably, even passing these demanding exams in various provinces. 90 years old and still taking exams. That really speaks to an incredible level of dedication and endurance.
It truly does. And what about farmers?
He also highlights the relentless nature of agricultural labor.
Huh.
For farmers, there was very little respite throughout the year. Just a brief period of relative quiet around the winter solstice.
Always working.
Pretty much. He emphasizes that even those hired as laborers worked diligently just out of sheer necessity to survive. He notes the very common sight of people, even children, constantly gathering manure to fertilize the fields. It sounds like a very physically demanding and continuous cycle of work.
Definitely. A tough life.
It was. And this pervasive diligence extended to laborers and artisans in urban areas as well. Smith gives examples of people routinely taking on multiple jobs at the same time just to make ends meet, like boatmen who would also pull ice sleds during the winter when the rivers froze, or farmers who would weave hats during the agricultural off-season to supplement their income.
Right, using every opportunity.
Exactly. He also notes the constant, almost habitual work of women. They could often be seen making shoe soles, for example, even while they were just chatting or socializing. It paints this picture of a society constantly in motion, always busy.
A constant hum of activity, it seems like.
Precisely. He also portrays merchants and their employees as working tirelessly, very long hours, few holidays. And he mentions the meticulous bookkeeping practices that often kept accountants working late into the night.
Okay, so across the board, really.
Surprisingly, he even depicts the bureaucratic sphere, which is often stereotyped, maybe, as being leisurely as an intensely laborious environment.
Really? Bureaucrats working hard.
According to Smith, yes. Officials working extraordinarily long hours and carrying a significant burden of responsibility across numerous tasks. He shares a detailed account of the daily schedule of a high-ranking cabinet minister to illustrate the extreme workload. He even mentions the reported death of one official due to sheer exhaustion from overwork.
Wow. That's a stark contrast to some, well, stereotypical Western notions of a more relaxed pace of life in the East back then.
Indeed. Smith also examines the sheer breadth of Chinese diligence. Remember, duration, breadth, depth.
Right, breadth, the number of people.
Yeah. He notes how significantly earlier people began their day compared to their Western counterparts. He gives vivid examples of bustling markets and widespread activity in various trades and regions well before sunrise, contrasting this with the relative stillness of European businesses at the same hour. He even quotes another observer, John Davis, who saw this Chinese love of labor as a positive sign that the government was succeeding in keeping the people content and occupied.
Interesting perspective. So we have evidence of widespread diligence, long hours. What about the depth, the intensity of the effort? Did he comment on that?
He did. Smith suggests that while centuries of experience had certainly taught the Chinese people the value and necessity of hard work, their approach perhaps differed somewhat from the Anglo-Saxon emphasis on a more outwardly hardy or maybe duty-driven exertion.
How so?
He implies maybe a more measured, perhaps even sustainable pace. A pace informed by generations of understanding the demands of labor. It wasn't necessarily less effort, just maybe applied differently.
Okay.
This observation then leads him to pose a rather pointed and frankly perhaps even problematic question, especially given the historical context of the late 19th century.
Uh-oh. What was the question?
He asks about a hypothetical future competition between the white and yellow races.
Oof. Yeah, that definitely sounds like a product of its time. Very loaded.
It is, absolutely. He then references Solomon's proverb, "The hand of the diligent makes rich." And he raises the question, if this proverb holds universally true, why wasn't the Chinese nation, despite its evident, undeniable diligence, the wealthiest in the world?
That's a fair question, I suppose, based on the proverb. What was his answer?
He posits that a potential lack of integrity and sincerity might be the missing elements, even though he acknowledges These virtues were certainly talked about in traditional Chinese morality.
So he blamed a moral failing.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
He expresses a hope for some future moral rebalancing that would finally allow the Chinese people to fully reap the material rewards of their undeniable hard work. So he links their diligence to a potential for prosperity that he felt was being held back by a perceived moral deficit.
Right. So he sees the diligence as a massive strength, but suggests this lack of integrity, as he saw it, was hindering its full impact on national wealth and development.
That is his central argument on this point. However, once again, the translator offers a really critical and, I think, quite compelling counter-perspective.
Okay, what does the translator say about this link between integrity and wealth?
They directly question this seemingly simplistic link. They argue that it wasn't necessarily a lack of individual integrity across the board, but rather that the deeply entrenched corruption within the civil service system, the
The examination system again?
yes,
Yeah.
that system actually incentivized and rewarded those who were highly skilled in social maneuvering, experts in the art of cultivating face and status.
Connecting back to the first point.
Exactly. And this often came at the direct expense of individuals who were genuinely honest and upright. The translator even cites historical figures like Zhang Guofan and Li Hongzhang as examples of individuals who, despite their abilities and maybe initial principles, often found themselves having to compromise their integrity to achieve any significant success within that existing system.
So the system itself might have actively discouraged or even punished honesty and rewarded other, maybe less virtuous traits instead.
That's precisely the implication. The translator goes on to argue that the pervasive lack of consistent support for genuinely upright scholars, combined with the constant desperate struggle for basic survival among the lower classes,
Yeah.
created this broader societal environment where truthfulness was often suppressed, maybe as a necessary survival mechanism.
Yeah.
And this ultimately hindered genuine societal progress and innovation.
Makes sense.
Their concluding thought is really powerful. Diligence, no matter how persistent, if it's not coupled with wisdom and fundamental integrity within the system itself, won't ultimately lead to true and lasting prosperity for the nation as a whole. It's a really strong critique of Smith's assessment.
It certainly adds a crucial and very complex layer to understanding diligence in that historical context.
Wow. Well, this has been a truly fascinating deep dive into just 3 of the characteristics outlined in this really thought-provoking book and this commentary.
It really has. It makes you reflect on how historical observations, even from over a century ago, can still spark such important debates and offer us these multiple perspectives on the intricate dynamics of a culture.
Absolutely. And as we talked about right at the beginning, it serves as a powerful reminder of the inherent challenges, the complexities involved in genuinely trying to understand another culture, especially one with such a rich and enduring history.
Yeah.
These excerpts, Smith's views, filtered through Smith's lens, they offer us a valuable snapshot, albeit, necessarily limited and potentially dated, of Chinese society as it was perceived then.
So for you, the listener, maybe think about what your key takeaways are from these observations. Which of these characteristics, the profound emphasis on saving face, the extreme levels of thrift, maybe driven by necessity, or the widespread and persistent diligence, which of these might still hold echoes today? Or how have they evolved in the China we see now? And how might China's incredible transformation over the last century have perhaps reshaped and moved beyond some of these historical perceptions? It's a truly fascinating puzzle to keep considering.
Indeed. The ongoing challenge, I think, lies in thoughtfully reconciling these historical perceptions filtered through these different perspectives with the dynamic and ever-evolving realities of a rapidly changing world. The quest to understand the multifaceted character of a nation, well, it remains an ongoing and deeply important one, full of nuances and complexities that continue to shape our global landscape.